Ready? So Jesus was probably not very good at his job. I don't mean the rabbi thing. I don't mean, like, Jesus was awesome as a rabbi. Like, don't get me wrong. He was an awesome preacher. You know, the whole miracle thing, that was pretty neat. Like, no one else could do that. Like, obviously, as a rabbi, as a preacher, as a religious guy, Jesus was just the best, okay? But remember, that's not his job. No one's paying him for that. Like, that's not his career. That's sort of his side gig he does at the end of his last 3 years or so on earth. That's sort of just the side gig, right? What he did for his job was actually carpentry. So Jesus' whole life, for the first at least 18 years or so, you become an adult at about 12, or at 12 in their culture, and then he's about 30 when he starts his ministry. For about 18 years, he's just an adult guy doing adult guy stuff and working and all of that, and chances are really, really good that he wasn't very good at it. I say that for not because it's in the Bible or anything. I'm not saying that there's a Bible verse that says and Jesus was a bad carpenter, but the context clues are pretty thick, are pretty they're pretty clear that that's, you know, something that's going on. So where we know Jesus is a carpenter is one day Jesus is teaching, and he's in Nazareth, he's in his hometown. And he's teaching, and some people like what he's saying, but most people don't. And one of the things they say is, you know, who is this guy who's teaching? He is just a carpenter, is what they say. He's just a carpenter. Now, that word that you use for carpenter doesn't just mean one thing. Greek is lovely like that. Why use lot word when few word work? And so they would, they would just say, okay, so we have this one word, and it can mean a carpenter who is like a skilled craftsman, who does, a lot of, woodworking stuff, really complicated stuff. Or that same word can mean kind of your blue collar laborer, kind of a worker who, he gets the job done, but like he's making a chair, like a farm implement or whatever, and it's not that big of a deal. So we don't exactly know what Jesus was, but it is a really good guess that he wasn't, an artist. He wasn't a skilled artisan. For one, skilled artisans were always respected. And it's really unheard of for you to disrespect somebody like they disrespected Jesus on the case of being, a skilled artisan. Like, you would never say, like, oh, well, he's just a carpenter. He's just a skilled artisan. He's just this. You would never say he's just that in their culture, because there is no just and then, that kind of upper class kind of worker. That by definition, you would say, oh, well, he's an upper class worker. Why is he teaching? Or they may say this upper class worker gives us a reason to listen to him because he's an upper class worker. So there's that. And that would make a lot of sense also because Jesus is from Nazareth. And at Nazareth, as is covered elsewhere in the New Testament, is not a great town. It's sort of a dump. It's nowhere. It's a backwoods place that nobody comes from there. Nothing good comes from there. And so you wouldn't expect there to be like this skilled artisan hanging out in Nazareth. You'd expect a blue collar worker who just, like I said, just does kind of mediocre work. It's very, very, very likely. It's exceedingly likely that Jesus is a normal, mediocre guy doing normal, mediocre work. Right up until the point when, he does ministry. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing normal, mediocre people who do normal, mediocre work. As it turns out, the person you're currently listening to is a normal, mediocre person who does normal, mediocre, at best, work. I'm a big fan of the guy you're listening to, okay? I'm a big fan of normal, mediocre people, all right? So I'm not criticizing, I'm not attacking, I'm not making fun of Jesus. I'm just saying what it is. And also, I'm not saying that like he was normal in that, like, I don't believe, of course, Jesus, I am positive, was a wonderful example of ethics and morality and like his dealings with people. I'm sure he was generous, and I'm sure he never cheated anybody. And I mean, again, don't get me wrong. But I think it's really, really important that we understand that Jesus was just a normal guy. And we think of Jesus as this superhero, this Superman, this guy, he walks on water. I mean, that's how we think of him. But the vast majority of people who met him, the vast majority of people who ever talked to him, the vast majority of people who ever encountered him just saw a regular schmo, A normal, mediocre guy who does normal, mediocre work. And I say all of that so that way I can establish that that is not what we're talking about this morning. You see, we're talking about Jesus. When we talk about Jesus, I think sometimes we can get in our heads, like if I just say Jesus, depending on who is hearing the word Jesus, you can hear in your head, like you filter it through your own thoughts. And some people, when I say Jesus, you think of, normal guy, or you think of, great teacher, or you think of, a divine, God in the flesh, or you think of, a superhero, or whatever you think of, right? What I want us to not think about is Jesus the mediocre carpenter. I don't want us to think about Jesus the normal guy. I have preached a lot of sermons over the last 14 years about Jesus the mediocre normal guy. I've done that a whole lot, and I will continue to do that, for the next 14 years, hopefully. It's just, that's not what this sermon's about. As we introduced last week, when we talk about baptism, and we talk about water in that water and blood conversation, what happens in baptism is we are united with Christ. But the fact of the matter is this: we are not united with a mediocre blue-collar worker from Nazareth. That is not what baptism is all about. That's not what's going on here. We don't need to be united. I can be a mediocre blue-collar worker on my own. We don't need that sort of union or that sort of unity with the divine. That is not what we need. What we need is something much greater. We need a union with a different Jesus. And anytime we talk about Jesus, there is obviously the human side of Jesus and there's the divine side of Jesus. And this morning and every time we talk about baptism, we are always talking about the divine Jesus. So let's take the carpenter Jesus and just set him to the side for the second. And we're going to talk about the divine Jesus and what it means to be united with the cosmic Christ, the one who made everything, the one who is the Word of God made flesh, the one who is, in fact, God walking among us. And as we talk about our union with him, we talk about our union with Jesus, the divine God, well, we need to talk about one of the oldest stories that has ever been told by anyone ever. And that is a story about the flood that destroyed the world. Now, the story of this flood that destroys the world is, like I said, one of the oldest stories that has ever been told by anyone. The oldest version of this story we can find is something like 4,500 years old, which is a really long time. It's a really, really long... It's a very long-lasting document. And we have a few different stories from then, and that's sort of a theme, because as it turns out, it's not just one group of people, or one person, or one nation, or one religion that tells us about a flood that destroys the world. In fact, it's not just a dozen. We have over 60 cultures have written down a story about a flood that God sends that destroys the world as sort of a reboot, rebirth, restart kind of situation. That's more than 6 different cultures, different nationalities, different religions, different people groups have done exactly the same thing. And what we need to understand about that is a couple of things. The first thing is, in all likelihood, just by, the laws of deduction, just our own reasoning, we should guess that something really happened. Like, you don't have 60 cultures from all over the world talking about one event, and that event didn't happen in some way or another. Like, a flood happened. Something happened. The problem with figuring out what, however, is that every culture does exactly the same thing. They take the basic elements of the story. You've got God, you've got flood, you've got a very few people being saved, you've got a kind of a reboot at the end of it, a restart at the end. Every culture takes those elements and they filter them through their cultural ideas. So here's what I mean. It's possible that the oldest version of this story we've ever read comes from the Mesopotamians. As it turns out, the Mesopotamians tell the story of a worldwide flood in which the Mesopotamian deities were angry. They were 4 of them, and they're the 4 who like to get angry a lot. It makes sense. So the 4 angry Mesopotamian deities decide to send a flood to wipe everybody out, but they decide not to wipe everybody out. So they tell a guy, hey, you've got a nice house. What I want you to do is tear down your house and build a boat out of your house, get in the boat, and you'll be saved. That's the Mesopotamian flood story. That's 4,500 years old or so. It makes a lot of sense. If you belong to the Mesopotamian religion, that's how they see the gods, at least these 4, and that's the way their culture operates. So, of course, as they're trying to interpret this whole thing, that's what they're doing. Another good example, if they're not the oldest, the Chinese are the oldest. It's really hard to date within hundreds of years when we're talking about, 4,000-year-old documents. And so the Chinese have their own version of the flood story. And as it turns out, in that version of the flood story, the one who tells the people the flood is coming is actually the divine emperor. The gods tell the divine emperor that the flood is coming, and he warns the people. So, in fact, the emperor is actually the hero of the story who saves the people who will listen. That makes all the sense in the world because, well, that's how the Chinese people understood the world to be. They have this emperor, he is divine, the gods speak to him. So, of course, the emperor is the hero of the story. What I'm trying to get at is this. In all 60 of these, there's like 63, 64, there's more than 60 versions of this story. All of them are filtered through the culture and the society and the theology of that culture. They're all looking at the same event and saying, let's explain it through our religion. Let's explain it through our culture. Let's explain it through our concept of God and how we see people and just everything else. What I'm trying to say is they weren't scientists, right? Like they weren't meteorologists. They weren't even like the terrible meteorologists that tell us that like tomorrow you're going to get no more than a quarter inch of snow. And then you wake up and there's like a foot and a half. And you didn't prep for that at all. Like not even a little bit. Like this is not who they were. They were theologians. They were poets. They were people just trying to make this make sense. Which brings us to the Bible. You guys know the Bible story already. I probably don't need to go into it. It's about Noah and his ark, right? As it turns out, that story makes absolutely no sense unless you're Jewish. This is an ancient Jewish recording of that ancient story that everybody wrote down. They wrote it down 1,000 to 1,500 years, depending on how you want to date things, depending on what you want to do with the Bible exactly. But 1,000 to 1,500 years after the Mesopotamians and the Chinese write, the Jewish people sit down and write out their own story. And it's just dripping with Jewish stuff. So, like, for example, when God's like, hey, I need you guys to build a boat and I'm going to send these animals, he separates the clean animals from the unclean animals. There is no unclean and clean in the vast majority of cultures when it comes to animals. That's a Jewish thing. That's what Jewish people do. So, of course, when they tell the story, you have unclean animals and you have clean animals. And of course, at the end, when Noah gets off the boat, what's the first thing he does? He worships God. How does he worship God? Well, he builds an altar and he gives a sacrifice. Because that's what the Jewish people did. They built altars, they give sacrifices. That's how they understand interacting with God. And when they write down the story, they can't write it down any other way because this is who they are. And of course, at the end, I mean, the story, the reason that this is something that's so valuable to you and to me and to everyone else through history is the depiction of God in the Genesis story and in Noah and the Ark is, man, it is so much better than like the angry Mesopotamians or the emperor or all the others. God is actually, he loves the people. I mean, not all of them. He doesn't love most of the people, but to the chosen people, the Jewish people, again, their framework as they understand things. God regrets everybody but the one he chooses. And so with Noah and his family, God doesn't just send a flood, but God actually protects them throughout the flood. And then God is the one who physically ends the flood. And then God's the one who promises, I'll never do that again. Because God seems to understand, like, well, I crossed a line. Now, understand, like, there's a lot of ways to read the Noah and the Ark and all these flood stories. There's a lot of ways to read them that are good and healthy and nice, and there's a lot of them that are not. But regardless of how we choose individually to read these things and how we are going to understand, historically what might have happened or where this is and what's going on with all this, Regardless, what we have to understand is nobody is writing down these flood stories as impartial observers to history. No one's doing that. Everyone is interpreting an event. A giant flood happened. Most people died. Very few made it out. And they're interpreting that through their understanding of God. And that becomes very, very important. Because something like 1,000 years after the flood story of Genesis is written, something like that, Jesus is born. And he lives and he dies and he raises from the dead. And the early Christians decide we are going to understand now all of the Jewish scriptures through the lens of Jesus. Meaning, just as the Mesopotamians looked at things through the ways that the Mesopotamians look at things, just as the Chinese people looked at things the way the Chinese people look at things, just as the Jewish people looked at the things through the lens of Jewish stuff. The early Christians said, we're going to look at everything through the lens of Jesus and who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. And as it turns out, the Apostle Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, one of his apostles, ends up actually giving us a reinterpretation of the flood story that is completely and utterly fascinating in one of his letters. So the context for this letter is it's been about 30 years since the church began. And that's about the time that it takes for the Romans to decide they've had enough of the Christians. There's this guy named Nero, and he finds these Christians, this weird culty group, at least in his opinion, it's this weird culty group, that he can realize he can scapegoat them for his own political failings. Politicians really haven't changed much over the eons. And so he says, well, here's some people that I can blame for all of my problems. I messed up, but it was those guys. And so, the Christians end up suffering and dying. I mean, literally being tortured and crucified and burned, and it's just this horrible thing. And so the Apostle Peter decides, I'm going to write a letter to these Christians who are suffering. I'm going to write a letter to these Christians who are in danger, who know that being Christian will get them killed. And by the way, he's not writing them from a detached, disconnected place. Peter, he writes this letter, and within a couple of years, he's dead. Because, he's living in the midst of it, in the middle of it. That's where he's at. So he writes them a letter, and he writes this utterly and completely fascinating thing around the concept of suffering. He tells the people, okay, look, you're Christian, you're in Rome, everything's going badly, you're going to suffer. But he says there's a difference between suffering for doing the wrong thing and suffering for doing the right thing. He says, if you suffer for doing the right thing, if you suffer for righteousness' sake, that there's a purpose to that God uses that you can do so much good with that suffering can become a vessel for good things. But it's only if you suffer for doing good. He's telling them, look, if you do bad stuff, if you say, well, forget it, if I'm going to suffer anyway, I might as well do the wrong thing. Okay, well, that's not going to work. He's trying to encourage them to keep at it. And in the midst of this conversation about suffering, this is what he says in the book of 1 Peter. It's in the 3rd chapter, and this is what he says about suffering and Jesus and, oddly, the flood. He says, Christ also suffered once for sin, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who was gone into heaven, and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers, having been subjected to him. Now, every now and then in the Bible, they don't put punctuation in. Paul is real bad about this. He has whole chapters. There's who needs a period? And right here, this is there. We needed 4 extra periods there, and we didn't have them. So let's try to break this down a little bit, okay? Let's work backwards. We're not talking about Jesus the carpenter, who is probably just a normal guy doing regular work in Nazareth. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the cosmic, divine Christ, the one that angels and demons and powers and authorities are subject to, the one sitting at the right hand of God, the one who is ascended into heaven. We're talking about Jesus, the creator of all things, right? We're talking about God, Jesus. That's the Jesus that we're talking about. And that's the Jesus that we're talking about with baptism. Because as it turns out, baptism has nothing to do with physical anything. So many times we talk about, it's an outward sign of an inward faith, or it's symbolic, or it's this. And look, it may be those things. But primarily, that's not what baptism is about. Baptism is not about a physical anything. As Peter says, it's not about the removal of dirt from the flesh. We're not talking about anything physical at all. Instead, baptism is about us appealing to God for a good conscience, or as a clean conscience, as some translations put it. It is us going to God saying, I want to have a clean conscience. I want to know that I am right. I want to be righteous. I want to know that I am where I need to be. That is what baptism is about. As we are united with Christ, we are where we need to be. We are holy and righteous. We are set apart. We're all of those things. And it comes through this symbolic act of baptism. Now, why? What is going on with water? Well, I'm not sure that we know, other than to say there's always been something going on with water. Because Peter actually says that baptism is like the flood. It's funny, all the time, whenever we hear the flood or we think about this, there's a lot of different pictures that go in our head, right? Like I said, there's been a lot of different people who've had a lot of different interpretations. A lot of fights have been fought over this. And what's funny is I almost never, to the point of I don't know that I have ever, heard anyone say that when we think about the flood, we should think about it the way Peter thinks about it. You've got an apostle here giving us an interpretation of the flood where he says the flood's like baptism. When we think about the flood, we should think about baptism. Why? Because baptism is God saving through water. And the flood is God saving through water. Now, we understand the first part, super simple. Noah and his family. Cool. But there's this other really, really interesting part, and this is why we had the introduction we did, okay? Because none of this actually makes sense if we're thinking about Jesus as Jesus, a carpenter walking around in Nazareth 2,000 years ago. If that's our picture of Jesus, this makes no sense. But if our picture of Jesus is Jesus, God in the flesh, Jesus, the one who made everything, Jesus at the right hand of God, everything subject to him through his resurrection. If that's the way we can understand Jesus, then we can understand what Peter says here. One of the things that's always bothered me, if I can be very, very candid about the flood story, is I'm given to believe a few things. Number one, that God is love. Number two, that God has never changed. And number three, one day, the God who is love and the God who never changed said, well, I regret making everyone, so I will kill them all. Now look, I can buy the third part of that. I can buy two of the three. Like, I can buy that God has always been the sort of being who, wants to kill everybody. I can buy that. I can buy that God is always the sort of being that, is loving. I can buy that. But you put the three together and you start thinking, well, look, am I being gaslit here? Is no one else seeing that that sentence is in the Bible? Like, it's right there. God, was regretted making everybody. So he's like, I'll kill everybody. Here's the thing. I think Peter had the same problem. I think he did. I think he had exactly the same problem. Which is why I think he gives us this information, which very nicely at least helps with it. You see, he says that Jesus went and proclaimed, that is the word for preached, to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah. Let's make that a little simpler. Jesus preached to the dead people who died in the flood. I'm not talking about the guy from Nazareth here. I'm talking about, the God who made everything. Now, by the way, this is not some weird, you might be, is that really the right way to read that? I mean, I suppose, there's always different ways of reading things in the Bible, and I get that, but, going back into the 300s, so 1,700 years, Christians of all kinds have read the Bible exactly this way. We call it the Harrowing of Hell. It's a really fun way of saying that when Jesus died on the cross, he went to Hades, he went to the place of the dead, and he rescued everyone. He brought them all out, and he saved them all. And man, I got to tell you, that's incredible. That's amazing. Because however I understand the flood, however I understand the Bible, whatever you want to read it as, if we're going to understand who God is, if we're going to understand who Christ is, or we're going to understand the way that Christ operates, a Christ who says, you know what, I died for everyone and I meant it. I don't just mean the living people. I don't just mean the future people. I mean everybody. I mean, this is one of 5, 6 different passages in the New Testament that directly references this event, spoken about all the way back into the Apostles' Creed. This is a very old, very ancient, very, dare I say, conservative way of reading this passage. And it's a beautiful way of doing it. And so this is what we have, is reimagination of this flood. This is what we read from Peter. Baptism and the flood are similar events, because baptism and the flood are God saving by water. And what God starts in Noah, Jesus finishes at the cross. And what God starts in our world, Jesus finishes in the cross. And the end result is that we are saved through our connection to Jesus. A clean conscience, holiness, righteousness. And that's true whether we get anything right at all. Because at the end of the day, this is all about Jesus. The cross, going to the abode of the dead and bringing everybody back and saving them all. And I mean, all of that's Jesus. I can't do that. You can't do that. This is why we need union with Christ. Christ can do things we simply can't. And because of that, we always have a chance at a new life. One day, Peter and Silas, his companion, were in a place called Philippi. Long story, don't have time for it now. Just understand that they end up arrested. They end up arrested, they end up beaten, they end up bloodied, they end up bruised, they end up shackled, they end up in this jail cell. So that night, Paul and Silas are, they're praying, they're singing, they're quoting Psalms to each other, they're singing the Psalms, whatever it is to be honest, I'm not an ancient Jew from 2,000 years ago. Whatever they did with the Psalms, they were doing, and they were basically worshiping God this whole time, probably, because they wanted to witness and have a testimony to the people that were with them, the other people that were in prison, and also probably to keep their own sanity. And so they're singing and they're praying, and it's at that point around midnight that there's an earthquake. Kind of. Sort of an earthquake. Like, it felt like an earthquake, but it was a really localized earthquake. It was one of those weird earthquakes that only moved some things. So there's this earthquake, right? And everybody feels it in the prison, at least. And for all the prisoners, their shackles fall off, and their jail cells open, and everybody wakes up, including the jailer. So imagine you are a jailer. You're a Roman soldier, or a former Roman soldier. You're a person who has fought for Rome is the point. And you are now overseeing these prisoners. It's a really cushy gig. A lot of times it was retired soldiers because it was an ongoing income that they could, didn't have to do a lot with. And so this whole thing, and you wake up because this earthquake happens. You go out and you see like the rows of the prison, and every door is just standing wide open. I mean, all you can imagine is, oh, great, everyone's gone. That's a problem. And so that's what happened. And this is what we read happened in the book of Acts as a result of this earthquake, this miracle. It says the jailer woke up to see the prison doors wide open. He assumed the prisoners had escaped, so he drew his sword to kill himself. But Paul shouted to him, "Stop, don't kill yourself, we're all here." The jailer called for lights, and he ran to the dungeon, and he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out, and he asked, "Sir, what must I do to be saved?" This is a really stunning situation beyond the miracle, okay? Let's set the miracle stuff aside for a second. This jailer had participated in Paul and Silas being put in chains, the very least. Chances are really good. On top of locking them up, he also would have participated in them being beaten and put in their place and tortured and all of that. I mean, he's one of the guys. It's really likely. It also makes absolutely all the sense in the world, given the ideological, theological world that we have here, that he is completely aware of who Christians are. He knows what Christianity is, and he does not like it. And so here's these people of this religion that he does not agree with, these people that he locked up. And he goes from that to saying, "What do I do to be saved?" and falling before them. So what changed? Well, it's really important to understand the reason I'm saying let's put the miracle aside is the miracle doesn't do it. The miracle does not actually bring this change in him. The earthquake doesn't bring the change. In fact, all the earthquake did was make him want to kill himself. And we can forgive him for that, right? Because, well, I know that September is Suicide Awareness Month, or Suicide Prevention Month, as Facebook keeps telling me. So maybe I shouldn't be preaching this in September. No, they prevented the suicide. There it is. It works. Perfect. So he's gonna kill himself. And again, it makes sense because Roman people, they do not forgive the loss of soldiers or the loss of prisoners by soldiers. They're gonna crucify him, and it's gonna be unpleasant, and it's gonna be awful, and he's gonna be condemned. And what is his justification? What's his argument gonna be? I didn't lose the prisoners? No, you lost the prisoners, right? So when he sees all the doors open, the earthquake, the miracle actually makes him want to die. It is only when he's offered a second chance that everything changes. Paul and Silas say, "Hey, don't kill yourself, man. We're all here. Don't worry. Let's come talk about Jesus." It's the second chance. It's the second opportunity that changes everything. As it turns out, the rest of the story goes like this, that they end up sharing Jesus with him, and he ends up baptized. He and his whole household are baptized before the sun rises the next morning, which is amazing and beautiful and incredible. And boy, does that teach us so much about what baptism is and about who we are and about why this flood thing makes so much sense. And so we're not talking about Jesus the carpenter. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about normal Jesus. We're talking about the Jesus who brings life from death, the Jesus for whom there is no end. There's no ending for Jesus. There's just something next for Jesus. That's the Jesus they share with him. And you see, however we understand anything, the story of the flood is a story of a new start. It's God hitting the reset button. He's restarting the computer. It's gone awry. Hit reset or hit restart. Oh, it's back. Okay, cool. It's a new start. Baptism is a new start, and these things are unilaterally God. God saves Noah unilaterally. Jesus saves the people who died then unilaterally, says Peter 1,000 years later. Because see, we can't save ourselves. Baptism's not about us doing anything. It's about us embracing the new start that God has given us. But it takes us understanding that need. And see, that's why this is not just a sermon about like, well, if you've not been baptized, you should get baptized. That's not what this is. I'm assuming most of the people in here have been baptized. And if you haven't, you should. But also, I'm assuming most people have. I know most of you have because I know you. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is this story, when we understand what's going on with the flood and the harrowing of hell and all this stuff, we're talking about our desperate need for God. We all have a desperate need for God. None of us gets this right. None of us. You know what's funny about the Noah thing? Everybody's all like, well, Noah's the righteous man. Do you know how that story ends for Noah? Noah sins terribly. It's a long story, but like, just you should go read it sometime. Like, Noah is a terrible sinner. This idea of like a righteous Noah is hilarious mythology. Like, there's no righteous Noah. I mean, there's no righteous any of us, right? The idea of any of us being righteous is hilarious mythology. Which is why we so desperately need help. We need second chances. And I don't mean like once or twice or 10 times. I mean, as human beings, we always need new chances. We always need new starts. We always need new opportunities, always. We may think we get it right for a while, and then, nope, not anymore. Like, we get it right up until the point where we don't. That's just it. Like, and then just starting over. So what we have to understand is that the gospel of Christ is about the idea that we have endless opportunities for new chances. Because, yeah, God is love. And Christ does save us. And when we think there's an end and we say, man, I got to kill myself with this sword, we don't. No, we got another opportunity. And that's why it's so important to recognize that this comes from the cosmic Christ, the Word of God made flesh. This is the divine creator of all things. He is the one who does this. He is the one who does this work in us. He is the one who works through baptism. And he is the one that we are united to moving forward all the time. This morning we're in our second week of our series called Water and Blood. And as we talk about baptism and communion, like I said, we'll focus on one at a time a little bit. This morning as we talk about baptism, we talk about the flood, we talk about Peter, we talk about the Philippian jailer. We're hitting just a whole lot of stuff. We're talking about the cosmic divine Christ. And exactly what we have in baptism through our faith for our entire life. Our second lesson is this. We always need new starts, new chances, and new life. Baptism reminds us we always have them through the divine Christ. We always need new starts, new chances, and new life. Baptism reminds us that we always have them through the divine Christ. This morning, the musicians are going to come forward. We're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week. Take God up on this to understand that he is unilaterally the one doing this. We simply embrace it. When we repent and are baptized, we are simply saying, I want all of that. What we just talked about for the last 40 minutes. I want all of that in my life. If you made the decision, nice more baptistry, let's talk. If you aren't an immersed believer in Christ, looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up while we do it. We want to understand, and we want to offer to other people second chances and third chances and 100 chances. Because the life we have is always, always new. Because the God we serve is always, always working. As we stand.